welcome to our audience in the studio and our audience at home. My name is Lisa Henderson. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University. And on this occasion, we recognize the original stewards of this land that we are on, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Chinangtan Nations, and the Lenape. It's my honor to start us off in recognition of Western's homecoming. And Pacinthe Mattar's appointment as our Asper Fellow since January, which wraps up with this occasion after a season of really distinguished teaching and project development. Pacinthe, thank you, and dear alumni and other guests, welcome. This is FIMS's 25th anniversary. We formed in 1998 with a convergence of the School of Library and Information Science and the School of Journalism. Undergraduate and later additional graduate programs were developed, and we have a lot to celebrate. I mention this because the journalism education tradition at Western is long, and I know we have School of Journalism alumni in our audience this afternoon. Also joining us are many who've graduated since journalism was a part of FIMS and since the program became MMJC, or Master of Media in Journalism and Communication, several years ago. Welcome to you all. For media and information to better serve the projects of truth, justice, and democracy, some transformations in the practice of journalism are and must be ongoing. Today's conversation between award-winning Canadian journalist Pacinthe Mattar and also award-winning U.S. journalist Wesley Lowery addresses the need for reporters, editors, managers, citizens, lawyers, sources, and regulators to reflect and to be accountable, true too of academics and academic leaders. One of the places where journalism as a system is troubled is in the practice of objectivity. If it's true that no one exists detached from their place in the world and the social, economic, and professional resources that shape and channel us, and I agree that that is true, then it really matters who reports on the world and how, what they know to ask, who their networks are, and who will talk to them. But there are barriers to entry into the practice of journalism, including the powerful idea that if you are a journalist of color reporting on communities of color, your standpoint is somehow compromised. Not so for Anderson Cooper or Maggie Haberman reporting on the 45th President of the United States, or Julie Van Dusen covering Parliament Hill, though permit me to add that the tradition of white women political reporters working at the centers of political power is barely 50 years old. Journalism and government are a lot older than that. That too was a fight. Pacinthe Mattar and Wesley Lowery are brilliant reporters and professional observers in print and in public of the changing practice of journalism, how it sometimes trades in double and triple standards depending on who's reporting and editing, who the audience is, who's in that digital Rolodex of sources, the kinds of questions reporters and editors ask. As journalists and producers committed to depth, context, and social reckoning, they are also guides in how journalism can be better practiced and better taught. At a moment where truth, facts, and context are everything, even as they are contested from every direction because they are contested, we are grateful both to Pacinthe and to Wesley for their work and for bringing their conversation to FIMS. Pacinthe Mattar came to FIMS as Asper Fellow following her appointment as Nieman Foundation Fellow at Harvard, and 10 years before that as CBC producer, especially at The Current, where much of her coverage focused on race and racism, police brutality, the Arab Spring, migration and refugees, and popular culture. In 2020, her feature essay in the Walrus magazine titled "Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists" won a National Magazine Award in 2021 and a Canadian Online Publishing Award in 2022. I encountered that essay as a Walrus reader and wondered immediately if Pacinthe would consider a future application to the Asper Fellowship at FIMS, and we are very lucky that she did. Wesley Lowery is a Pulitzer-prize winning journalist, author, and on-air correspondent. He is the executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop, a nonprofit newsroom based at American University in Washington, D.C., and a contributing editor at the Marshall Project, which covers the U.S. criminal justice system. He is also journalist in residence at the City University of New York's Newmark Graduate School of Journalism. In nearly a decade as a national correspondent, Lowery has specialized in matters of race, justice, and law enforcement. He is the author of 2 books, They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and A New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement, and more recently in 2023, American Whitelash. Universities have always been important places for journalists to hone, experiment, change, and teach their craft, ever more so as we lose news organizations, especially local news coverage in many jurisdictions, to business pressures. At FIMS, we want to support accountable storytelling in journalism and in communications locally, nationally, and internationally. I'll now turn the conversation over to Pacinthe and Wesley Lowery. Following their interchange, Professor Tom Streeter, who is acting graduate program chair of our Master in Media, in Journalism and Communication program, will moderate the Q&A with members of our studio and online audience. For those of you who are joining online, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type your question there when the time comes. Pacinthe, over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dean Henderson. Thank you, Western University, for hosting this event. Thank you to everyone in the room with us here today, to those joining us on the live stream. And of course, a very big and special thank you to my guest today, Wesley Lowery, for making the time to speak to me, and who I'm excited to be in conversation with in just a moment. Wow. Is this ever a very full circle moment for me? In the summer of 2020, I wrote my piece for the Walrus, Objectivity is a Privilege Afforded to White Journalists. I had pitched it in a moment of utter frustration, despair, and dare I say despondency about not only what was happening in the world, but our media's ability to cover it. And what spilled onto the page was basically 10 years worth of my time in media, trying to tell stories and the behind the scenes of what happens. It took 3 months from pitch to publication. And so many times during that time, I almost gave up on it. But every time I went to bed thinking, I can't do this, it's too risky for me to be talking about journalism in a small market like Canada, where our institutions are very few and the world is very small. I would wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to email my editor and I'm going to call this whole thing off, I can't do it. But somehow the pressure and the feeling of not saying anything at a time like this grew to be worse than the discomfort and the anxiety I felt in saying it. And so I pushed through with help from a fantastic editor, Samia Madwar at the Walrus, through a huge village of friends and group chats that were going off all summer. And Wes, though you wouldn't know it at the time, with help from you. I remember listening to you articulate some of the very things that I was writing about that had come up in my career. I remember listening to a podcast that you had done with Longform, I believe, in which you talked about the police. And one of the quotes that you said that I ended up using in my Walrus piece verbatim as a quote was about how the police are not in and of themselves neutral observers of things. They are literal characters in the stories that we cover. Then, of course, came your piece in the New York Times, A Reckoning Over Objectivity, led by Black journalists, which captured the frustration that Black journalists have long felt and the pushback they were voicing to legacy institutions and how they were often punished for speaking out when they felt coverage missed the mark. And Wes, Listening to and reading your words at the time helped push me and my writing forward. So this is an opportunity for me to thank you on this occasion for helping me find the words at a time when I was very close to giving up on them. I could have never expected the impact of what happened when I released my article. August 21st, 2020, 10 a.m., pub day, I thought would mark the beginning of the end, or rather the end of my time as a journalist in Canada, given what I was writing about. But I never would have expected what happened next. It traveled far and wide. It was added to journalism syllabi across Canada and the US. I was invited to guest lecture at almost every journalistic institution in both of those countries. It garnered a National Magazine Award. I got the Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University, where I got to lecture on the article and then teach my own long-form writing class. I assigned my article as mandatory reading, and Wes, yours as well. And here I am today, capping off my time as Asper Fellow in Media right here at Western University by getting to talk to you about all of this, Wes. But I admit, and I'll be honest with you, that I'm almost like a little tired of talking about objectivity. And I wondered if together, you and I could have a kind of send-off to this conversation about objectivity. Or rather, not the conversation about objectivity, but the bad faith critiques and the people who seem to kind of willfully misconstrue the points that we were trying to make about the application of the principle of objectivity. I know from your writing, from your tweets, from talking to you, that you have come up against this a lot. And I hope that together you and I can kind of have a goodbye objectivity, goodbye to all that today. I want to get into what these last 3 years have been like, how you got to think about your work, your approach, your understanding of objectivity, and where we go from here. But I want to start much earlier, before the moment we find ourselves in now. And so, Wes, this is my formal thank you for being here. And my first question to you is to ask if you can remember the exact moment or time where you first kind of came up against this flawed notion of objectivity or the way that it has been applied.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and excited to get to participate with your breakup from this conversation. Usually breakups only involve two people, and we invited a whole studio audience. And so I'm excited for this conversation, though. I think that it has been an important one, even as it's been really frustrating. As you noted, there are a lot of people, some of whom have kind of willfully misconstrued what this conversation is about, others who, for one reason or the other, are actually incapable of understanding what it is about. They're not even willfully doing it. They just don't understand what they don't understand, which I actually think speaks to the underlying critique here, that so much of institutionalized journalism is run by a set of people with such a narrow set of perspectives and experiences that when they encounter someone who thinks and has experienced differently, they actually shut down. And we've seen this time and time again as powerful people in our industry have attempted to engage this conversation in which they have simply misstated what is being said, misconstrued the critiques, responded to straw men, right? Because they otherwise they're for whatever reason, one or the other, incapable of hearing these critiques for what they actually are. I think that for me, although now I do some work in academia and do some editing as well, right? My critiques of the media have always been as a practitioner, right? I spend the majority of my time doing journalism in newsrooms. And so this was not, the critique of some politically charged outsider or some out of touch academic, but rather someone who was working every single day in the leading newsrooms in the United States of America and doing a lot of journalism. And what we see when we encounter and have to grapple with the critiques of a practitioner are the critiques of the dissonance between our principles and our practice. Right, that there is this sense and this idea of what objectivity is supposed to mean in its most simplest term or form, meaning that our journalism is an accurate reflection of objective reality in so much as we can report it, right? And secondarily, that we follow a rigorous journalistic process by which we seek to capture the totality of objective truth, right? That's obviously deeply inoffensive and something that you and I both endorse wholeheartedly, right? What we see, however, as practitioners are the ways in which our practice falls woefully short of that principle, and the ways in which that principle has now come to encompass and mean all types of things that are not actually objectivity, right? I'm trying to think about when the first time I encountered it is, but I think the reality is it's difficult because I think working in newsrooms, you encounter these conversations all day, every day.
Yeah.
That we think about, okay, well, this piece needs a quote from the other side of this conversation, right? Or very, which is an appeal to a balance, which very often is now used synonymously as objectivity, even though objectivity does not require balance. There are times in which there is language or rhetoric or writing that is more plain spoken and then is changed and written to be more official sounding. And that often you hear from an editor who might say, let's make this more objective, right? That again, the idea of the plain spoken journalistic speak or a more neutral tone or an inverted pyramid structure became a stand-in for objectivity, even though that's not what objectivity means, right?
Yes.
And so we kind of see this over and over and over again. But beyond that, what I would see time and time again covering communities that were not always the communities that were prioritized by my news organizations, both contemporarily or historically, is that you would see these cases, and you would see this both as a writer, but also as a reader of the paper or of the outlet, areas in which we allow someone to just say something and areas in which we demand it be cited and sourced more differently. Things that we are allowed to say as a journalist and a writer versus things where we have to couch them in one way or the other, right? That what we see and have seen time and time again has been issues where reporting and thorough reporting and rigorous reporting would make clear what an objective truth is. And yet we use language in our newsrooms and in our copy that would suggest as if there is some type of debate over what that truth is, right? And we do that and claim that that is the pursuit of objectivity because we don't want to offend anyone but the reality is it's the opposite. And so I think that that's a big part of what I think about it.
Wes, you've talked about objectivity as a kind of cloak that we put on as journalists, and one that you don't necessarily like in the way that we cloak ourselves with objectivity. What do you mean by that? For people who are just coming into this, who are thinking, what's the big deal? Objectivity is good for journalism. What do you mean by objectivity being a cloak often being for the truth?
I think that the thing we have to deal with is that there's a difference between doing journalism that is objective, that reflects objective reality, and being journalists who market ourselves as objective.
Right, so it's the perception. It feels like what we're really talking about here is, and I think we hear this all the time, we don't want our readers to have the perception of us being biased. And I want to drill down and ask, why is that a bad goal, to avoid the perception of bias? And not only a bad goal, but perhaps impossible, and especially for people like you and me. This obsession with perception of bias rather than bias in and of itself.
And it really is. If you look at the core of the Times piece that I wrote, and then I followed up with the Columbia Journalism Review piece, there was no critique of the concept of objectivity. The critique was that we in fact have put in its place the perception that we put our marketing ahead of doing what we're actually supposed to be doing. It was interesting. There was recently a quote unquote debate held here in the United States between Len Downey, a former editor of the Washington Post, and Bret Stephens, a columnist in the New York Times, in which they were supposedly debating journalistic objectivity. Now they both basically agree, and so it was kind of silly. But then they got around to the point, but they both do agree we shouldn't call things racist in the newspaper because some readers might not like that, right? And so again, they both it was this prioritization of perception, and it had nothing to do with whether or not the objective facts show that a thing is true, right? Now we talk about adjectives we pretend as if they are inherently opinion, but adjectives are very often fact. My shirt is white. White is an adjective, right? It is that you writing clearly that my shirt is white is not veering into opinion, right? There are things that are definitionally racist or sexist, right? Calling them that is not an opinion. It is a fact. And if the objective evidence supports the usage of that fact, and yet we don't do it for some other consideration, to me, that's a journalistic failing. And what we're seeing here is that, to go to I mean, not necessarily any less fraught example, right? But imagine we had a subsection of the population of the country believed that the sky is purple, right? Is our job in our coverage to be trusted by the people who believe the sky is purple? Or is our job in our coverage to make it clear that the sky is blue?
Or
right?
that a U.S. president did not, in fact, not get
Win the
elected.
election.
Yeah.
Correct. Well, that's where it's going to go next, right?
Yeah.
And so what do we do if by telling the objective truth, by reflecting objective reality, we will now be perceived as unobjective and untruthful by a subsection of our population? Now, let's think about how that applies to people of color, to women, to people of any minority group, whether that be their gender expression, or their sexuality, their immigrant status, right? That we have groups in our societies who we understand we have both historically and contemporarily disbelieved, right? Who we have not valued in their full humanity, who we have not granted full citizenship in our public square, we have not listened to their voices and perspectives. And we know all contemporary studies, all polling shows that our population still carries these stereotypes and discriminatory mindsets towards women and people of color and all types of folks. So what does it mean then to be a journalist who, because of something immutable about yourself, is less likely to be trusted? Is your job to now pull punches and bend over backwards so that people who are predisposed to distrust you trust you? Or does your job remain to tell the truth? And I think the danger of making an idol out of the perception, out of the marketing, is that we are fundamentally no longer, as our lodestar, focusing on what our journalistic job is. What is true? What does the reporting show? What can we prove? What are the facts? And we are now trying to play this weird calibrated game of the theoretical reader out there. What will they believe? And do they like this word? And do they trust us in this way? First of all, that's an unwinnable game. But second of all, I think that exposes a further bias, right? This came out, heart of this conversation, heart of this debate emerged when our former president in the States attacked 4 congresswomen of color. I told them to go back to the crime-infested countries where they came from. Now, that line of attack is definitionally racist because it's definitionally xenophobic, which is a form of racism. This is one of the most storied attacks in the history of American politics, where someone doesn't look like you, is from somewhere else, and so therefore they are delegitimized in the political sphere and said, you're not a real American, go back to where you come from. You have no standing to participate in our politics, right? It's xenophobic, and xenophobia is a form of racism. And so the president's attacks were definitionally racist. What we saw were news organizations that used euphemisms. These were racially charged attacks or racially tinged. Now, from a grammar and syntax perspective, those are terms that don't mean anything. Racially charged is a meaningless term, which is not what we should fill our news copy with. Words
And they
that
take longer to write, and they're confusing, frankly.
that don't mean anything,
Yes.
right? If something is definitionally racist, we should call it racist. Now, I remember at the time I was working at the Washington Post, and we were having a debate about this internally, what we should use and how we should use it. And an editor who I'm close with came to me and said, well, but so many of our readers don't agree on what the definition of the word racist means. And if you use this word, they're going to trust us less. And I said, well, but that is limited in part on who you imagine the readers are and which readers you prioritize. My grandmother is a Black woman in her 90s who is a reader of the Washington Post. And if I write an article in which something that is clearly, definitionally on its face racist is not called that, is that going to make her trust me more or less? Because my grandmother is reading this article and seeing that I'm refusing to be honest about the world as it is. And I think that so often we have calibrated ourselves for who we presume the reader to be, and that reader is always a presumed white, middle-class, moderate Republican.
Here in
And-
Canada, I was told to think about Susie from Saskatchewan, who is the same profile as you're describing right there. That's the imagined
single
reader, the
line.
imagined listener always.
And so what does it mean for us to, one, accept that we live in a diverse, complicated society full of all types of different types of readers? Second, that this white, moderate, moneyed perspective is not a neutral or objective neutral, right? It is one perspective. And so why are we prioritizing and prizing this perspective and not everyone else's? Right? And beyond that, what does it mean for us as news organizations and as practitioners of journalism to do journalism that services audiences and people who we've neglected for our entire histories? What does it means? It fundamentally requires us to consider some other people, not the same people over and over and over again.
Wes, I want to delve into this, the media's kind of lack of literacy on race, our reluctance to call things racist. If we don't want to call people racist, because we can never really know what's in someone's heart, we can call tweets racist, policies racist, or rhetoric racist. And I want to talk specifically about Trump's campaign, his ascent into the presidency, and just how ill-prepared it showed the media industry to be, and how allergic mainstream media and legacy institutions were to using the word racist. And not only with Trump, but there seems to be such a reticence and a kind of pretzel twisting, as you were saying, to engage with race as a factor in many stories, and specifically with the rise of white supremacy, which I know you're covering in a very intense way and is the subject of your latest book. I remember for me, during Trump's presidency in 2016, in the early days, I remember pitching a story about how Muslim women in Canada were starting to feel worried for their safety. They were seeing the rise in rhetoric, they were starting to feel targeted and unsafe, especially those who wear the hijab, who are visibly Muslim. And I remember pitching it at a story meeting, keep in mind this is, still 2016, and getting a lot of skepticism, a lot of pushback, like, oh, that happens over there. In America, that's not us. Months later, January 2017, a white man in Quebec City opened fire on a mosque and killed 6 people. And investigators later found that he had searched Trump over 800 times in the weeks leading up to the attack. And as we speak today, there is a trial underway for a man accused of deliberately running over 5 members of the Afzal family right here in London, Ontario, who are Muslim, in June of 2021, killing 4 of them. In the trial so far, we've heard that the man told police after the attack, "I meant to kill them. I don't regret what I did. I admit it was terrorism. It was politically motivated 100%. And that police found a manifesto called A White Awakening in his apartment. Your latest book, American White Lash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress, documents and analyzes how Barack Obama's election fanned the flames of white lash, of white supremacy, as a response. And we know this is not unique to just the US. How do you square the largeness, the significance, the importance of race as a lens to understand the world that we're in and what's happening today, with media's, as you mentioned and as you talked about, reluctance and inability to name things for what they are, and their inexperience in talking about race?
I think that we understand that race and identity broadly is one of the key fault lines upon which we live atop, right? That this is something that it remains a key to understanding how we've structured our societies. It is something that remains key to understanding what someone's opportunity and experiences may be. And even as we work to combat that reality, I think we have to sit with and grapple the reality of the extent to which it still is the reality. When we look at the media, it's always interesting to go back to Walter Lippmann, who's cited as, one of the godfathers of this idea, the concept of objectivity. And I've written a bit of how I think a lot of people take him out of context or haven't read what he actually wrote. But I think very often to a line from him where he talks about how the chief censor in the minds of members of the media are in fact their own preconceived notions and their own beliefs, right? The biggest thing preventing something from making the newspaper is the editor's own belief that it's not real, right? That the biggest bias in our media collectively in a given newsroom or of a given journalist is our own set of beliefs and biases, right? It was why there was an advocacy for a more rigorous process, because it was understood that we were building newsrooms that could not see beyond their own experiences. Unfortunately, I think that remains true. And so what do we know about those who run our news organizations, own our news organizations, and staff our news organizations? We know that our news organizations and our professional press corps do not reflect the diversity of our nations. We know there are people who've been systemically excluded from not just being in the room at all, but certainly from positions of power. And we see the ways that that skews and shifts coverage. In the United States of America, there was a deep denial among the gilded and elite class of the press that racial animus could be the driving, motivating factor in Donald Trump's election, because the white people who run political coverage refuse to believe that other American white people could possibly be motivated by racial animus. And yet what we have seen, we now have the benefit of hindsight, is every reputable study shows that that was the case. The Tea Party was driven by racial animus. The Trump movement was driven by racial animus. In so much as there was a movement of Obama to Trump voters, they were the people who scored more highly on racial animus, right? And so, but yet we contorted ourselves for years, insisting this must be about economics, and let's go to another diner in Ohio. And like, when it was clear to anyone with eyes, historical perspective, or pigment in their skin what was happening. And yet those perspectives, and by the way, they weren't even perspectives, right? That reported expertise was disregarded so that our press corps could insist to us that it was not raining outside, even though we were all coming into the house drenched.
Right.
And I think that there was a key issue there that, again, in one of the key limitations of our political press as it related to the rise of the most openly nativist president in modern American history was the belief among the press corps that this type of messaging could not be appealing to the American masses, which shows the extent to which the political press corps is completely out of touch with the people for whom they're ostensibly writing, who found this type of nativist appeal remarkably appealing, so much so that they may reelect this man from prison.
Speaking of nativist appeal, the Tea Party, racial animus, 2019, you are still working at the Washington Post, and you are reading a piece by the New York Times, a retrospective about the creation of the Tea Party, this kind of early conservative movement. And you read this piece and you think they're leaving out a key piece of why the Tea Party was created. And I want to read an actual quote that you tweeted about this piece. So you tweeted that the New York Times story about the Tea Party failed to note how this early 2010s conservative movement was, as you put it, quote, essentially a hysterical grassroots tantrum about the fact that a black guy was elected president. For the record, the Times eventually did update their story to include this racial context, but in what is now a very public dispute between you and then executive editor of the Washington Post, Marty Barron, he pulled you aside and said that you had made statements that were, quote, overtly political, that, quote, maligned the Times, and basically threatened your job. And I wonder what you make of that incident. What was going through your mind at a time when you were trying to say the creation of this political party and this political movement was rooted in racial animus? And I'm here to point it out because it's going over the heads of people at the New York Times. And the response you get is, you're violating social media guidelines. If you keep doing this, you're gonna lose your job. And not only that, if you wanna do this kind of reporting, well, maybe you should go into advocacy or opinion writing. Take me through what you're thinking at the time as this is blowing up.
Well, I think two different things are true. I mean, I think first, I think it's important to recognize, I think that I think that we've developed an unrealistic expectation that when we work in mainstream news organizations, that all of our communication in every venue would reflect the way we would write in those organizations. When I send text messages to my friends, I don't actually use the same sentences that I use when I write in the pages of the Washington Post, for example. Now, social media, I think one of the difficulties of social media and I think media institutions have had a miserable time with this, is that social media is a semi-public, semi-private space. And what I mean by that is obviously public, right, in that we are publishing, right? But it is not the same as our edited, curated work. The social media, especially Twitter at the time, was functionally a chat room, right? And that we understand that we use different language, different cadence, different expectations in different formats. The Washington Post publishes on TikTok language every day that it would not publish in the newspaper. And we understand that because of the platforming differences. And so what I think has been difficult for a lot of news organizations is that news organizations have demanded or attempted to, they've failed at it, but they've attempted to demand that their employees on privately owned social media platforms that are semi-public, semi-private, comport to the edited standards of their newsroom, which again just doesn't actually make any sense, right? Editing adds value, right? And so how a reporter is participating in a chat room, it would be remarkable if it could comport to a copy edited, that would actually speak to not very much value being added by the layers of editing going. But what I think about all that, and so I say that to say that the exact sentence I wrote there was certainly half a step more glib than I might have written it in the Washington Post. But what I wrote was accurate and remains accurate. It was accurate then. The response, it was on my beat and the thing that I covered, an area in which I have expertise. And so much so that in response to both what I wrote and others, the New York Times corrected the article, and Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, came out and said, yeah, that was a failing. It was completely ridiculous that we wouldn't touch on that issue. And so, again, I think that in journalism, it's hard I don't know that we can value anything above being factually correct, and I was. And so, in so much as some retired editor had a temper tantrum about it, that's on him. I will say that I think that there is and it's one of the reasons I talked about all of that coming into it. I do think that from a leadership and editing perspective, I do think that there has been an over-focus and freak out around the idea of social media, and that fundamentally comes down to power and control. That publishers were used to having complete monopoly on what the people who they employed said, and they no longer have that. And I think that there's a real tension there. That's not a genie, I think, is going back in the bottle. And I also think it is a fundamentally massive waste of our time, right? That the reality is, if you have people who, we understand that every journalist possesses opinions. We understand that every journalist in cases that are not under their byline writes sentences where they haven't checked every single fact or done everything. Now that's not to excuse inaccuracy in our public. I think it's reasonable to expect that if a journalist is associated with a news organization, the things they say in public should comport to some type of journalistic standard, right? But I do think it is unreasonable and frankly just a waste of time to run around pretending as if social media posts are articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that if it could be argued that someone has expressed an opinion, that somehow undermines their written work. We know and we understand that journalists are all humans and journalists all have opinions. So why would the acknowledgement of the existence of opinion undermine their journalistic work? I actually don't think that there's a coherent argument to be made here.
Right.
Once you remove it from but we're the boss and we're in charge, so you do what we say. right? I think that it comes from the mistaken marketing, the suggestion that the journalist's job is to sacrifice all of their personal agency and in fact become a news robot who possesses no opinions, right? And that is not, if that is the ideology in which journalism is going to engage, we are not going to be capable of developing the diversity within our newsrooms required to actually reflect objective reality in our work.
Yeah. I've, spent a lot of time either fielding questions from fellow reporters and peers being like, can you just look at that tweet? Should I take this down? So much of the kind of backroom channels that we talk about, the hypervigilance of what we appear to be on social media versus the actual work. And I think this is one of the fundamental ways that objectivity is misapplied. It's a critique that is often leveled towards us as people. And we all know, we all have bias, but it's so very rarely about the work itself. The work which then goes through editing, which goes through a process of verification and a discipline. And I think it's so frustrating that we spend so much time collectively worried about our social media feeds. And, I know people listening right now have been called into managers' offices time and time again about their tweets, which are often, again, not wrong, but that might upset, our imagined reader. And I wonder, Wes, what you make of something that has been very frustrating for me, and we kind of allude to it in this conversation about social media and what happened with you and Marty Barron at the Post, is I feel like as an industry, as journalistic institutions, we have not found a way to have these conversations about objectivity, about bias, in a way that is not inherently like being disciplined or being punished. People are often, and as I speak right now, I have friends of mine who've been pulled off beats, which they live and breathe and are absolute experts in, because their social media presence on the topic offends higher up. And I think it's such a loss, and I think it's such a waste of time, and it leads to, people actually leaving institutions that they could really end up serving with their expertise. And I wonder, what do you think about how do we find a way as institutions, as outlets, and as an industry to have these conversations without them being so, top down, so almost punitive, and one that literally threatens and oftentimes does end careers for people? How do we find a better way to have these conversations? That's something I think about a lot, and I don't know that I've come up with a good answer. What do you think?
Sure. I mean, look, I think that it fundamentally and foundationally requires a humility. And I think that humility, and it requires a humility of those leading and facilitating the conversations, right? We've created this weird subculture in journalism, where as a reporter, you don't know anything. You're supposed to ask a bunch of questions. The day you become an editor, you're an all-knowing deity and you're not allowed to be questioned. Mm-hmm. And once again, we know what the statistics shows about who gets to run newsrooms, who gets to be in charge, who are the middle managers, right? We understand the perspectives that are overrepresented in those spaces and the perspectives that are deeply underrepresented in those spaces. And then we take these questions about who we are, how we show up, what we should be, who our reader is, and we allow those decisions to be made by that very small subset of people who get to have power in our industry. And I think that there has to be I think fundamentally, so much of what we've seen, it's been framed as objectivity fights, it's been claimed as like culture clashes and generational stuff. So much of it's about bad management. That so many of our newsrooms are run by people who are know-it-alls and don't think they have to consider anyone else. Now, these are the same geniuses who refused to get on Facebook and didn't think we had to have paywalls, right? They also ruined our industry. But they don't believe fundamentally that anyone else has spent any time thinking about anything, that other people's perspectives are worth listening to and hearing out. What we see is we, for the first time in our history, have an attempt at an integrated press. Now, we haven't done it particularly well, but we are within the first 30, 40 decades of even having newsrooms that ostensibly claim to be reflective. And what that means is that when you bring different types of people into the room, they are going to bring with them different perspectives, different experiences. They've done different readings in addition to yours. And what I think we see too often is people say, oh, no, 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 we want different type of people, and then we want you to get here and shut up and not say anything. We want you to become a clone of the institution as it is, so that we have a more diverse face when we put the staff photos up. But we don't actually want you to bring with you any of your expertise, any of your experiences, any of your perspectives, any of your feedback. And that, I think, is the tension we are seeing time and time and time again, is that we bring different people into a room, and those people say, hey, that thing doesn't make sense, or that doesn't serve me, or that doesn't serve who we think our readers are. And the organization or its leaders go, shut up. We didn't bring you here to, to make anything better. And I think, unfortunately, like I said, we see this boil over time and time and time again. How we fix it, like I said, I think it requires a level of humility and a desire to actually hear from the people who we bring into our room. And very often, even extremely well-intentioned editors and leaders do not actually want to learn from the people they're working with. There was a quote from Norm Pearlstein, the former editor of the LA Times, where he was talking about how we live in an era where we no longer live in the era of the autocratic strongman editor, but rather that to successfully run a newsroom today, you have to have the consent of the governed, which is not something that's ever been true previously. And I do think that rethinking newsroom leadership, where we actually have to have the buy-in, not just from the top, but from the bottom, is something that could soothe a lot of the framing of a lot of these conversations.
Yeah, and speaking of not wanting to actually hear from the people that you employ under all the fancy diversity statements and hirings, I want to share a story of one of the most perhaps formative examples of how I came up against this. And it ended up being the way that I kicked off my Walrus piece, because it was just such a visceral experience. But in 2015, I was in Baltimore. It was the days after Freddie Gray's death, young black man, violently arrested for having a knife, later found to be a completely legal knife, but violently arrested, thrown in the back of a Baltimore police van, and violently handled in the course of that rough ride, as they call it. Spinal cord is severed, and he dies after being in a coma days later. And Baltimore essentially erupted, as you know, into protest. Mm-hmm. And I went to cover the aftermath of those protests and this city's revolt, essentially, against police brutality and what was happening there. And the day that I landed on the day that then State Attorney Marilyn Mosby had actually announced charges against the 6 police officers who were involved in his arrest. None of them would go on to be charged, but the charges being announced was such a rare sign of accountability that when I landed in Baltimore and went straight to Freddie Gray's neighborhood, the Penn North neighborhood, it actually felt like a block party. There was music, dancing, babies, DJs, and people were feeling like maybe this time we're actually going to get justice. And that day, I was just wrapping my first day of reporting. I stayed till night fell. There was a curfew in place, 10 p.m. I was starting to feel the mood of the neighborhood change. You know, the police presence was slowly increasing. The National Guard was there. And, you know, I could just feel that things were about to get tense, and I could hear the helicopter circling overhead. And I was about to get into the subway when I heard a young man stop me and say, "Hey, what news organization are you from?" So I was doing a radio documentary about Baltimore, and I turned on my recorder, asked him his name, and I asked him one question and one question only, which is, how many Freddie Grays are there in Baltimore? And thus began what would go on to become a 45-minute conversation between me and him. He told me his name was Lonnie Moore, and as we were talking, another man came up and joined the conversation. And I stopped and asked him what his name was. He told me it was Jared Jones. And the reason I bring up their names is when he told me his name was Jared Jones, I pulled out my notebook and I said, Jared Jones, J-A-R-E-D, and he said, nah, J-A-R-R-O-D. And the reason I brought it up is because I had failed my very first J-School assignment, I had gotten the name of a source wrong, and my then professor, Bob Ortega, said to me, if we can't trust that you can get a source's name right, how can we trust anything else that you report? So since then, I have been so particular about getting sources' names right. Anyway, I listened to these 2 men talk And basically, for 45 minutes, they exchanged anecdotes and stories. They were completing each other's sentences, mirroring each other's experiences, total strangers to each other. And what I keep coming to is just the power of what I heard in those 45 minutes. And I'm going to play a few minutes of that. But before that, before I play this tape, I wanted to set up a few things. And I bring this up because taking this story home and trying to get it on the air became a whole issue that ended up being a big piece of what I wrote about in the Walrus, and I'm sure something that you've come up against a lot. But I want to introduce you to Lonnie and Jared. And before I actually play the clip, this is them. Lonnie is in black there. Lonnie Moore is in black, and Jared Jones is in red. So I'm about to play a little bit of our conversation, and a couple of warnings. There is some very strong language, some graphic depictions of police violence. Within a few seconds, you're going to hear use of the N-word. So I want to prepare you for that. And you're also going to hear a few references that I want to explain so that you can understand what they were telling me. You're going to hear them say, those kids being as brave as they were to do what they're doing, we salute them. And what Lonnie and Jared are referring to are the kids that are kind of credited with having started the protests in Baltimore at a local mall called the Mondawmin Mall. You'll also hear them say what took place earlier was just a sample of our injustice, and what they're referring to there is obviously the death of Freddie Gray. And finally, you're going to hear them say, if they think Monday was bad, it's about to be worse than that. And what they're referring to there is the fact that a CVS was literally set on fire and ended up making basically every newscast. A CVS is on fire, a CVS is on fire, and that's how a lot of people came to know about the protests happening in Baltimore. So with that, here is a 3-minute clip of my conversation with Lonnie Moore and Jared Jones in the Penn North neighborhood of Baltimore in 2015.
In some cases, they call you names. In some cases, they call you names. I've been called nigger, thug, any name you can think of by the police. And some, and some of them are white and some of them are black. It's not a black and white thing. It's a civilian police thing.
And the people that aren't from here, and like I said, have never grew up in environments like this, they think that we make that. I think they think that we making this stuff up.
You know what they also think?
You know
They
what I'm
think
saying?
that we playing the victims.
Yeah,
Oh,
like-
you sell drugs. What do you expect? You deserve to die. Come on, man.
Oh, well, that's your fault because you live there. Listen, my father a firefighter. My aunt owns a hair salon. My grandfather worked for the city of Baltimore until he passed away. You know what I'm saying? We didn't need or have to live where we live at in this city. We chose to live here because we love this city, we love our neighborhood, and we have hope that things will change and things will get better. You know what I'm saying?
That's why I told her, them doing what they did, those kids being brave enough to demonstrate what we, I salute them too. Because they gave us a platform for us to speak the way we're speaking now.
Yes, they did.
Without them doing what they did, we would still be being ignored. You know what I'm saying?
We would still be being ignored.
They don't put brothers like this in front of the camera. They're not going to put him on CNN. They're not going to put me on, on Fox 45.
They're going to run down on the dude with the glasses on and a mask on his face.
They want to interview them. You know what I mean? They don't want to interview they don't understand that there are intelligent black men that come from together.
We've been crying about all this same stuff for the last 30, 40 years, and they've been boiling and boiling and boiling and boiling. And sooner or later, something is going to boil over.
Pretty much.
It's going to boil over sooner or later.
And I don't mean to speak negatively, but that was what took place earlier was a sample of our injustice. The fact that they, we weren't sure if they would even be, tried or charged.
Right.
If they don't convict those police, oh my God.
If they don't convict those police, they think Monday was bad.
It's going to be worse than that.
It's going to be bad.
Unfortunately. And we're not promoting negativity
right,
or anything
not
like
promoting
that.
Negativity
We're just speaking on the
or
understanding of the environment that we come from.
That's all. Like, it hurt me I cried watching
I did
Bill
too.
O'Reilly on TV talking about stuff that he don't know nothing about. He ain't never been harassed by the police.
He ain't never been searched for no apparent reason, having them reach all in your
come
private
on,
areas and everything.
Come on,
for no
man.
reason.
The police will grab you, make you pull your pants down in front of people.
Yes.
And you know what they tell you? Lift your sack up.
So they can search
Lift
under there
up
for
your
drugs
sack.
or anything like that. And they do
That
this in
is a
public.
violation of your human rights right there. They not supposed to be able to do that. But they do it because they know that they can, and nothing will happen.
And that goes to
Nothing
answer
will
a question
happen.
that you asked me earlier. You said, how many Freddie Grays do I feel exist in the city of Baltimore?
Man,
He's Freddie Gray.
it's
I'm
plenty
Freddie
of 'em.
Gray.
It's
We all
plenty of
Freddie
'em,
Gray.
man. They just ain't killers.
So what happened after that interview is something that I'll never forget, and it's something I think about a lot. I thanked them both. I put my Marantz away. I'm about to get in the subway to go back to my hotel. I don't know if you could hear it in the clips, but you could hear the helicopters are starting to circle and things are feeling real tense. And just as I'm about to walk into the subway station, there's a police officer telling me and Lonnie Moore had left. It was just Jared Jones and I trying to get on the subway. A police officer says to us, you can't come in here. You got to leave a different way. So we try to leave a different way. There's more police officers in the intersection telling us you can't leave this way either. And before we know it, every time we try to leave the intersection that we are being told to clear, we are being stopped by police officers telling us we can't leave that way. Things ratcheted up very quickly, and before I knew it, there was a police officer chasing both myself and Jared Jones, brandishing his baton, calling Jared Jones every name in the book. And we ran. People, when I was going to Baltimore, people are asking me, oh, are you scared about going to Baltimore or whatever? But the most fear that I felt in my time in Baltimore was in that instance, trying to get out of the intersection and being worried about what would happen in this moment. And I remember that night ending with, once we got out of there, Jared Jones sitting on the sidewalk, head in his hands, crying and saying, we're tired. And it was just such a visceral example of, they had just spent 45 minutes telling me about what life was like. And then I saw it right in front of me. And, one rookie mistake that I'll never forgive myself for is that I had turned my Marantz off and didn't have the tape for this to play in my documentary. But I say this to say, I returned to Toronto after 36 hours in Baltimore. It was very short. And I wanted to play the very tape that you just heard as a preview of some of my coverage that was coming from Baltimore. I had a whole documentary that was being prepared. And I was so eager to showcase the power, the conviction, and the just everything that I'd heard from Lonnie and Jared standing in that corner. And basically, I cut the tape, I filed it, and then I get, my executive producer at the time says to me, we're not running this. And I didn't understand why, so I went to her office, and the first thing she said to me was, have you called the police to confirm and get their account of what Lonnie and Jared are talking about? I had, of course. Journalists call bodies that are accountable and that are implicated in stories, so I had called the police, and I had also called the police union. My calls and emails had gone unreturned. And then came a question that was frankly so confounding to me, but she asked, how do you know that these men had given you their real names? And I was so kind of confused by the question, but in that moment I remembered my fixation on getting Jared Jones' name right, of stopping him and getting him to spell Jared, not J-A-R-E-D, but J-A-R-R-O-D. I offer this to her. She seems unswayed and says that this is not going to run, and begins lecturing me about the principles of verification and accuracy in reporting. So I feel like I've just lost a battle that I didn't know I was about to be in, and that this piece of tape is not going to go on the air. So I get back to my desk, and if not for the attention and someone that I was working with on the team, an older white male colleague, saw my face when I came out of the office and asked what had gone on. I told him, and he went into my executive producer's office to talk to her. And all I know is that when he came out of that office, she had changed her mind. And that piece of tape ran. That story has just been front of mind, and especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder, I was thinking of just how easily Black people's experiences, especially with police, are so often disappeared, manipulated, or disbelieved entirely. And so, Wes, as someone who has long covered and written about police, what roadblocks or pushback have you encountered in doing so?
Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about it might have even been on that same night. I was out at Penn North and I was working on something else, but I was helping the Metro desk. And some of this is racialized and some of this isn't, right? What's also true is that we have institutionally, and you quoted this earlier, right? We've decided that the police are objective, neutral observers. And so because of that, we are dispositionally protective of them. We're inclined to believe what the police say and disinclined to believe people who contradict the police. So on that night, the police were using tear gas and rubber, like they were using stuff to disperse. And I was sending in feeds to help the staff cover what was happening. And they're like, well, but the police on their Twitter account said that's not what happened. I'm like, well, I'm standing here. I'm pretty sure I know if I was just hit with tear gas or not, right? And by the way, at that point, I wasn't just, any reporter in the room. I'd been covering unrest in American cities at this point for 8 months, 9 months, right? I actually had spent a lot of time in these exact scenarios in Ferguson and New York and Cleveland, elsewhere, to understand the specifics of how particular we have to be about that type of thing, right? But it becomes in this case where too often, unless the police will confirm a thing, we won't say it. Again, as if the police are arbiters of neutral factual information. And I think that is a real blind spot, and that cuts in all types of hyper predictable ways. We as news organizations, we value and supremely value information that can be cited to people and institutions and organizations that we believe carry with them inherent credibility. And we undervalue information from people who we or our audience may theoretically find less elite or less credible, right? And that cuts in all types of ways. Every one of our news organizations allows the police frequently to accuse people of crimes on background, and we publish it in the newspaper, right? Unnamed spokespeople accuse people of felonies every day in the newspaper. If the guy standing on the corner giving you his full name and social security number, we don't believe him enough to put it in. And I think that I think that for us, we have thrown off the calibration of the skepticism we're supposed to have of the government and of government agencies and political government actors. But secondarily, we have at times, as we were talking about earlier, right? So much of the censor of the press is what we are willing to believe is true and what our editors are willing to believe is true, right? How much stuff do we leave on the cutting room floor in our notebooks or we never even use because we don't actually think it falls outside of our experience, and so therefore it might not be, right? I think that's dangerous, and I think it leaves a lot of people's experiences excluded from our coverage.
Wes, I want to probably going to do a couple more questions with you, and then I want to open it up to Q&A. But speaking of on-the-ground reporting, I want to ask about your time in Ferguson in 2014, the aftermath of Officer Darren Wilson shooting and killing 18-year-old Michael Brown. I want to know what, being on the ground there and staying as long as you did. I understand you were supposed to be there for 3 days, and it ended up being 3 months. How did your on-the-ground experiences, what you saw, what you heard, kind of challenge and complicate your idea of how the press covers events like this and how it impacted your understanding of the media's ability to cover movements like this accurately? What did you see?
Well, we were so limited and confined by what the police said happened. Not just in the initial incident, but in every night afterwards during the unrest. Every night we were reliant completely on the police to craft a narrative of what had happened the previous night, even as we had all stood there all night. And we would put them on television, often saying things that directly contradicted what we ourselves had experienced or witnessed. saw time and time again. We would see in front of our own eyes arrests take place that were clearly unjustified, but then report the arrest numbers that evening without questioning what had happened in those other cases. And so it spoke to a tension in journalism, where is it our job to accurately record what powerful people say, or is it our job to figure out what actually happened? And I think too often we're just doing the first thing. Well, but this is what the police chief said, and I got all the words right. That's how he said it. And so now I have no journalistic obligation to figure out if what he said is actually true. And I think that our media ecosystem and our news information ecosystem is dealt a deep disservice by the extent to which modern journalism spends the vast majority of its time, effort, and resources mindlessly parroting things powerful people say, and in such a small component of it actually figuring out what is and is not true.
I'm thinking of the press release that went out after George Floyd's death, which we now know to be a murder. And I'm listening to what you're saying, and I know we've all thought about this. If not for Darnella Frazier taking a video of what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd, standing, kneeling into his back for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The press release said that that Floyd was under the influence, that he was experiencing some kind of medical episode. And again, that video disproved that, and the world saw it. And I wonder, for people who know this dynamic to be true, what are ways that they can disrupt this kind of over-reliance on police narratives and police statements in the absence of a video like the one that we saw in Floyd's murder?
Look, I think that for us as journalists, I think first and foremost, we just have to insist upon better journalism, right? More explicitly and directly cited sources. If someone says something happened, showing up. Because here's the other thing, right? Every news organization in Minneapolis rushed to aggregate this police press release, and if anyone had sent someone down to that street corner, they might have gotten the biggest scoop in the history of America. Darnella Frazier didn't have to post that to Facebook. If a single reporter had shown up, maybe they would have given it to her. That, as we now know, there were dozens of witnesses. Had anyone shown up and talked to anyone? Instead, all the initial coverage was written solely based on a single unattributed press release from the police, right? That so much could be improved by us just following what are our ostensible standards in the first place. Figuring out what happened, calling people, showing up, not just taking one source, right? And I think that, unfortunately, in the pursuit of speed in our digital world, and with the emptied out newsrooms and the disappearing resources, which unquestionably is part of it, that we are publishing a lot of journalism that just fundamentally does not pass journalistic muster, that needs more time, more space, more reporting. And what we end up doing is we end up publishing, this is the exact same thing that happened, by the way, when Eric Gardner was killed. New York Times wrote a single source piece based on what the police said in their press release, couldn't be bothered to send someone to Staten Island, and that's why the New York Daily News got one of the biggest scoops of the year when they got the video. But go read the piece by the New York Times the day after Eric Gardner was killed. It's the exact same thing. It's the police on background saying he's overweight and out of shape and it's his own fault, and like from the very beginning. And even though we now know there was a whole slew of witnesses who were there, many of whom might have been there if someone would have shown up on the scene that day. And we know there was video from multiple angles that was been taken by bystanders. That, again, so much of our journalism, it's like it's not even some special sauce. It's just like, what if we called some people on the phone and asked what happened? What if we went to the place and showed up and interviewed people? What if the police just saying something wasn't enough for publication? Mm-hmm. And theoretically, that is already theoretically our standard, but we all see the coverage every day.
You mentioned dwindling resources, and I feel like everywhere we look now, journalism is financially at risk. We've seen mass layoffs at Vice. Here in Canada, TVO workers are on strike right now looking for a living wage. And it seems like every nonprofit newsroom that had the wealthy donors that, gave them some big cash in 2020, it seems like that's running out. You've said more than a few times that, the market is not going to support the kind of journalism that is going to help democracy flourish. Where do you see the solution for this?
I think we have to think about and really explore other ways of, if we think that a healthy news information ecosystem is vital to a healthy democracy, which I think we do I think that, then why do we then allow the health of the news information ecosystem to be determined by the capitalistic market? Right? We get what we pay for. We get the news and information that we pay for as a society and as a structure. And I think that we have seen time and time again efforts to try to move that and convince the masses and the populaces to support via subscription and donation, and that has just not worked at scale. It does not support the information ecosystem that we need to be a functioning democracy. The United States, compared to any number of other countries, spend significantly less money on public media than others do, and I think that there is a real, I don't have a fully developed theory of this yet, but I increasingly really think that we need a massive taxpayer investment if what we actually want is a healthy media system. That if it's important that every single person in the state of Wyoming has quality news and information, and every single person in the state of South Dakota and North Dakota and in the poor parts of Texas, right? Well, we know the market is not going to support that. We've tried it. It doesn't work. We're a country covered in news deserts, in places, in parts of major cities. I'm in Washington, D.C., and if I go to Southeast Washington, D.C., into the black part of town, there's going to be one or two news outlets that ever pay any attention to this place because there's not a lot of ad revenue. There's not a lot of subscriber base. Literacy rates are low, right? But do those citizens not deserve quality news and information? Is it not vital to their participation in democracy that they have that information? I think that we have to rethink, because I think so much of what we deal with, so many of the critiques at the heart of our frustration with news and journalism come down to sensationalism and speed with things that are about capitalism. They come down to who we imagine our audience to be, which is a moneyed white audience, which comes down to who we think can subscribe, who we can get advertisements from. What would it mean to be able to do journalism in a world where it didn't actually matter if people bought the newspaper in the morning? What mattered was what the newspaper said was correct. What would it mean to create television or radio that was not first and foremost concerned with ratings, but could first and foremost be concerned with journalistic quality? And the reality is none of us have ever worked in a world where that's true. And I imagine that our journalism would be better if we could take any step towards a world like that.
Two final questions for you, very quick, and then I'll go to Q&A. I can see the antsiness in the audience. I know they got some questions for you. I want to ask about some bright spots in journalism. We've been talking a lot about what's not working, what the failings are. I myself think of Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, which sought to redefine American history and Black people's contribution to the founding of America. And I'm also thinking of my former CBC colleagues, Connie Walker's work, her genre-defining podcasts on missing and murdered Indigenous women, the latest of which, Stolen, Surviving St. Michael's, delved into her own father's history at residential schools, but was also a lesson in a history of Canada that is so rarely taught. And Connie, just this year, won a Pulitzer and a Peabody back-to-back for her work on Stolen. What are some bright spots that you look to in journalism at a time like this?
I think that, so one, I think that we are seeing a movement to have more historically informed journalism, which I think is very important. I think it's remarkably important, and I think that has been that's been a really good thing. I think that as we have seen the expansion of nonprofit news, especially at a local level, I think we have also seen some interesting conversations about what does it mean to actually service communities that have not been serviced, right? That the solution is not to drop a New Yorker magazine in every poor neighborhood in America. I helped the Marshall Project work on their Cleveland expansion, starting a bureau there. Well, what does it mean to provide a news organization in a space where the majority of residents don't have high school literacy levels, right? Again, doing long-form New York Times articles is not actually going to service that the needs of that population. And so I think for us, I'm very encouraged by the work being done, one, by any number of organizations in thinking about what does it mean to service audiences that we've previously not considered, and secondarily, what does it mean to bring people into the public square who've previously been excluded from it. So I think about like the Prison Journalism Project, that I do a lot of work with, which aims to train and facilitate the publication of journalism by incarcerated people and incarcerated impacted people, saying, okay, if this is our information news ecosystem, this is our public square, who is being systemically excluded from these conversations? And how do we find ways to prompt their inclusion? And so I think there's a lot of great people doing a lot of really smart, great work in these spaces, even as there are still some big structural societal issues with how this all works.
Speaking of big structural societal issues, you in April penned almost like the final gauntlet throw in this objectivity conversation called A Test of the News for the Columbia Journalism Review. When I read it, I was going to be that annoying person that tweeted like every single paragraph because it was just so quotable and so satisfying after these years of conversation. But in it, you offer 6 ways forward, practices and procedures that we should take into account when doing journalism to produce good journalism. And I wondered, people are going to be wondering, so if not objectivity, what are we aiming for? If objectivity is as flawed in its application as we have been saying it is, what should we do instead? So I wondered if you could take us through in a shorthand. I'm going to drive people to read your article because it is very good, and I hope people have read it. If they haven't already, they go on to read it. What are you suggesting as practices that should guide our journalism to help us get away from all the ills that we've been talking about in our time together?
Sure. I think there are 6 values or not even that, because I think the values actually are a different conversation. I think there are 6 practices that we should be seeking. I think the first is rigor, right? That if I'm judging a piece of journalism or a journalist for their quality, have they called everyone? Have they tracked down all the relevant context, right? So much of the journalism we encounter is not rigorous. And so that it is objective is actually useless to me, right? It is objectively true that the police put out a statement yesterday saying George Floyd died of a medical incident, right? The objectivity of that news article had nothing to do with its utility, its quality, or its trustworthiness. Mm-hmm. But rather had this been rigorous, had this person shown up to the place where this incident happened, interviewed people, added additional information, asked questions of the police and other people, had it shown rigor, it would have been more trustworthy and would have been better journalism. I think we need to have a commitment to fairness in our journalism, right? Have we sought a complexity of, have we sought all of the potential sides and perspectives on a thing? That does not mean that we broadcast all the perspectives and sides on it, but have we considered them, and have we fallen too quickly into easy villains and heroes, and right? Fairness, context. I think we should value context, right? Again, is this just an accurate recording of what happened yesterday, or am I placing this actually into a context that helps me understand what happened and what is happening? Transparency. The reality is any number of us have any number of conflicts that at times can be disclosed, but in other cases, there are questions of what is our process like, right? That I think we can demystify and be more structurally humble with how we present the journalism that we've done. Hey, I called this person 2 times, but I couldn't get a hold of them. Or this wasn't an email, or this was like, and I think that there has been any amount of movement that has moved towards being more transparent in that space that allows readers to understand what they are reading and how they understand it. I think that we need to explore nuance, right? We need to lean into the gray. I think that very often a lot of our coverage falls into very specific narrative storylines when very often the truth is far more complicated than that, right? But I also think we have to seek clarity, right? When the weight of the objective evidence says something is true, we need to be willing to say that that thing is true. Our readers need to be able to trust us to tell them if it is raining outside, not to quote two different people debating whether or not it is raining. And, or saying that, it's a precipitation charged day instead of that it was a rainy day, right? Like the world, and I think that, because again, as we know this in our personal lives, we know this in our institutions, right? As humans, we value people who tell us how it is, not who obfuscate with all types of nonsensical language. And so I think that clarity is important. And I think that when we look at those ideas, right, that those ideas can apply not just to news coverage, they can apply to opinion coverage. Is this argument rigorous? Is this argument fair? Has this argument engaged in nuance, right? It can apply to organizations that see themselves as politically aligned, and it can apply to organizations that see themselves as politically neutral, or whatever they want to call themselves, right? The idea is, how do we create practices that actually apply across journalism? And I think that is, and again, that focus on the work itself, right? That are not focused on the individual, are not focused on the perception of the reader, but are focused on the work on the page. Is it fair? Is it nuanced? Does it include context? Is it rigorous? And does it have clarity? Is there transparency to the process? That is something that we can look at a piece of journalism and we can judge it, engage it, and in a way that I think would service us. And I think if more journalism was more rigorous, if it had more context and nuance, if it had more clarity of language, and if it was focused on fairness, and the process was focused on fairness, I think we would be more trusted.
Solid advice for journalists, current and upcoming. And speaking of upcoming, I know there's upcoming journalists in the room, listening on Zoom, and I'd really like to invite questions from the audience, either in the room or online. And if you're a student journalist, I will try to encourage you to ask a question. I have 3 of these fun TVO Like It Matters t-shirts to give away. So if you're a student journalist who has a question, I will give you a t-shirt in reward. But please, if you have any questions, Wes and I are keen to get them. So just to repeat the question was, what was my favorite piece of reporting on the Baltimore story? Honestly, I think it was seeing the joy that day. Like, I went in expecting, I didn't know that the charges were going to be announced the day that I landed. And I was kind of primed for frustration, for anger. And it was such a beautiful thing to see this neighborhood that had been so upset, that had literally been set on fire in frustration, before what happened with me and Lonnie and Jared. It was so beautiful to see joy and music and babies and kids and a hopefulness. And it's heartbreaking to say that, because in hindsight, I know now that none of those police officers were charged. And I was actually just, Wesley and I were both at this racial reporting convening in Boston this weekend, where I met Lisa Snowden, who runs the Baltimore Beat. It's a community-based organization and newspaper that covers Baltimore exclusively. And the person whose story that I had gone to document in my radio documentary, it was the story of Tyrone West, who had been pulled over in a traffic stop and chased and beaten by police officers, and who died. And his sister, Tawanda Jones, every single day since her brother's death, has been protesting outside of Baltimore City Hall trying to get justice for her brother, because, yet again, the police officers involved in his arrest were not charged. So you asked me what my favorite thing was. It was just seeing a sliver of a different kind of story when it comes to the story of police brutality and of Black families trying to get justice for their loved ones. Thank you for your question. You get a t-shirt. Any other questions? Are there any on Zoom? Can you reframe your question for me? Like, would you like me to share about some of the work, like some of the stories that I did cover? Yeah. Yeah, well, one of them, again, I think, especially when I spent time in the US last year at Harvard, so many of my American friends would be like, oh, you come from Canada where everything is good, you have no racism, everyone gets the support that they need. And one of the stories that I think Canada is known for, although it's a little more or less straightforward than this, is the story of how we have welcomed refugees and migrant people. And one of the last stories I did at the CBC was a radio documentary about Yazidi refugees. These are women from northern Iraq who had been captured by Daesh or by ISIS in 2016, held as sexual slaves, and had gone through the worst possible torment. And so many of them have come to Canada as refuge. And, I think we all remember Justin Trudeau standing at the airport handing out warm coats to Syrian refugees. And the image was that Canada is this gold safe haven for refugees. But what I heard from those women was that it was not a happily ever after story that they were in Canada. While they were grateful to be safe, they basically felt like they were still experiencing the trauma of what they had gone through because their sisters, their nieces, their aunts were still in captivity. And they used, in our time together, they appealed to the Canadian government to do more to resettle refugees, to not just have it as this happy storybook ending. And just more recently, I think we all saw this summer refugees, predominantly Black refugees, sleeping on the streets of Toronto. Shelters were not opened up to them. And I think it's stories like that I think it's so often Canada really does like to have this smugness about this doesn't happen here, we're better. But often cases, it's the same. It's just that we have perhaps a perception of things being less worse here. But I think anti-Black racism, anti-refugee sentiments, so many of the ills that we talk about the world over are here in Canada as well. I see a question in the back. Natalia is asking about how do you go about disentangling everything that we've been talking about the difficulty of covering police, the kind of, she put it as closing ranks, if you will, of government agencies and police. She talked about citizen journalism and how it is maybe offering another way of covering these things. And I think fundamentally the question, as I understand it, is knowing the forces of the way these powerful government agencies work and these institutions, how do we as journalists move forward and continue to do that work in a meaningful way against these perhaps pressures or challenges?
Sure. I think as individuals, it's very difficult. We all obviously are operating within these systems and structures that are bigger than us and that are difficult in a lot of these ways. That's one of the reasons I think it's important for us to have these conversations that are big and structural and systemic, right? That we need to push back on the demands of immediacy and traffic that are driven in a lot of ways by the digital world we live in, right? I think in a time when there are more citizen journalists, it's more important than ever that the professional practitioners uphold the highest standards of rigor, that's the appeal here, because we know that the police now have the ability to put their press release out to the world. It's our job as the journalists to figure out what actually happened. And I think that, I think that the hope is that we will be rewarded when we do that. That requires an upfront investment in time and resources and energy that we're not seeing in a lot of places, but I do think is really important. And so, I don't know, I think that it's tough, it's difficult, but I also think that, it's urgent.
Thank you, Wes. And I'll just add one quick thought. And I'm thinking again of the story of missing and murdered Indigenous women here in Canada. And I'm thinking of the story of residential schools here in Canada. And, Connie Walker has talked, and I know many other Indigenous journalists have talked about just how often pitches along those stories were brushed aside. Connie's talked about this multiple times. She'll pitch a story about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it's, oh, not another dead Indian story, Mm-hmm. And I think there is, and what she did, and I think a testament to her work and so many other Indigenous journalists, is believing the people who say they have had these encounters and following those stories and doing, I'm particularly obsessed with Connie's latest installment of Stolen, Surviving St. Michael's, because she delves into her own father's residential school history. And it starts with a story of her father, who went on to become an officer himself, stopping someone on the highway, a driver, and he stops this person and sees that it is a priest that he says abused him while he was at residential school. And she hears this story by way of her brother, and she's like, how have I never heard this before? And Connie uses the tools of journalism, investigation, verification, research, looking at documents, and to tell the story of what happened. And I think so often it is a question of resources, and not just resources, but willingness to allocate those resources to do those stories. And that's how you get a Pulitzer-prize winning, Peabody award-winning story like Stolen. And I don't want to make it out to be just about the awards. I think just the power of having people have their stories heard in media. And for generations, you know, from as early as when I first started at CBC, I just saw how easily things have changed a little bit, but I don't want to say it's like, you know, it's all solved now. But so often there is just such a dismissiveness and a lack of interest in following up on those stories from the people who've experienced it. And I think the way forward is to listen to them, to investigate, to do the rigor, the verification, the accuracy, the context, the balance, all the stuff that Wes has been talking about, and apply it to those stories as opposed to just saying, are you sure they gave us their real names? Thank you for your question. Is there a question? Yes.
Tom Streeter, I'll have a microphone so the people, so Wes and people online can hear me. And I'm just, part of what's so powerful about your story about Baltimore is you put yourself in the story. I mean, you don't make it about you. You very artfully, but your experience there is part of how the reader really captures what went on. And it's, you know, we teach journalism here, and we have to worry about this. Like, when should reporters put themselves in the story and when not? Or maybe that's a minor issue. Maybe that's not the main thing. But it's some reporters agonize a little bit about that. And I wonder if you have advice for folks about that.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. I mean, I tend to, as much as possible, not be in stories, but I mean, let's be honest, my Walrus article was as much about me and my experiences as it was a systemic critique of media. And I used myself as a vehicle to say, this happened, and this happened, and I'm not alone. And I think that can be very powerful. You know, traditionally we teach that journalism and journalists should stay away from the stories, that they should not become the story. But again, I mean, I just spoke about Connie's work on Stolen, and she, you know, she put herself and her family, her own father, in the story, and I think there's real power in that. And I think this distance piece is actually a luxury that traditionally journalists who do journalism, journalists who have had the ability to never have any stake in any story that they're covering is a luxury. And I think that personal experience can elevate, can add nuance, can add expertise to stories. Do I think wholesale that every journalist should always put themselves in a story? I don't think so, but I think it can be a very, very powerful vehicle to tell stories and to elevate, especially when there's a systemic issue. But you know, we exist in the world too, and I sometimes get frustrated at the lack of ability of us to be able to talk about our experiences and to put it on the public record, especially on issues that affect so many of us. Wes, what do you think?
No, I agree with that completely. I think that I actually think we are largely underserved by the shorthand that journalists should not become the story. In that, I think it, you know, in that I think that it often polices behavior in ways that is not helpful, right? It's that sometimes as journalists, we do have experience that become our avenue into exploring something, and that our story is not enriched by the transparency of explaining that. I also think it allows us to traffic in the fiction that there are journalists who do not have skin in the game, right? That all types of journalists pitch all types of stories that are really grounded in their own experiences, perspectives. And one set of journalists is consistently asked to personalize that work, and while another set of journalists is allowed to write that work as if it's the voice of God, right? And I actually think that the extent to which very often, I think that voice of God framing or that third person AP style framing is a means of codifying, like I said, putting in the voice of God things that are in fact really the experiences and perspectives of members of predominant groups in newsrooms, right? And so I think that there's something to be said for that as well. Like I said, I don't think that I think that too much of journalism is too obsessed with the hyper specifics of form, right? And whether versus again, what I would note, like, all right, is this rigorously done? Is this fairly written? Is there nuance and complexity and context? Is there clarity of language? You can write a piece that is completely removed, in which the journalist is not a story that comports to those things, and you can write a piece where the journalist is a character that comports to those things. And I think that either one of those is good journalism.
Okay, I'm going to take this last question before we adjourn. Go for it. You got the last one.
Do you think that there's something to be said about this objectivity? It's not only that it's assuming who the audience is and it's writing for the production, but it's also assuming who the writer should be, that there's this assumption that you should, like, I don't know, this objective body, the voice of God. The God is actually, in this instance, I mean, very much this, like, white perception of, like, white middle-class God. This space should be occupied. And so then the expectation that there's, like, neutrality in the voice that you're using is so that all of the whole line, the production line, the producers, the writers, and the audience is all perceived to be that same body. Like, I guess I just kind of said my own answer, but that's my thought. Anyways, so what would you think about that?
I think that, I certainly think that's true. I think what is also true is that a lack of clarity and a presumed neutrality very often functions to service the status quo intentionally or not, which is not a neutral position. That when again, if you have a politician who traffics in misogyny, xenophobia, and racism, and you soften the language with which you describe that, you are providing an in-kind donation to that politician, right? It is not a neutral act to understate through a lack of clarity someone's racism or sexism or misogyny, right? And this is true on any number of issues, right? If the police have killed someone and you call it an officer-involved shooting, you have, in effect, weighed in to lessen the public skepticism of the police's behavior through your lack of clarity of language. And so I think that's what, I mean, so often the language that we in newsroom parlance talk about as being neutral or objective is actually pro-establishment, right? It's like a calming, and I think that in and of itself carries with it its own political bias and it influences our political system in its own way.
Wes, I'm going to let you have the last word on that, and I'm also going to thank you. I've often talked about this kind of work as this relay race that we're in. You know, you take the baton, you run with it. I took the baton and ran with it. And we pass it on to the next person. So thank you, Wes, for running with the baton for as long as you have been. Thank you from me and from a lot of us. It's helped me run my part of the race, and I hope to get back into it soon, alongside you and so many others who do this work. Thank you.
Thank you.